Imagine standing on a battlefield, the clash of swords silenced, the cries of men fading into dust. Your husband lies among the fallen, his blood soaking the soil. You reach for him only to feel rough hands seize your arms. In that instant, you realize death would have been mercy, because for the wives of defeated warriors, the true horror was only beginning. Their survival was not salvation. It was a sentence. Before we descend into this forgotten chapter of history, make sure to subscribe and hit the like button. This channel is where the shadows of the past come alive, where we reveal the hidden, the tragic, and the dark stories that were never meant to be told. Join us, because history's darkest truths should never be forgotten. The battle was over. Silence hung over the fields like smoke, broken only by the groans of the dying. Crows circled above, waiting for their feast. The earth reeked of blood, iron, and sweat, a stench that clung to the bodies of the living as much as the dead. Defeated warriors lay scattered like broken statues, their swords slipping from limp fingers, their lifeblood sinking into the dirt. But the battle's end did not bring peace. For those who survived, especially the women left behind, it was only the beginning. The women stood trembling on the edge of the battlefield, clutching their children, searching for husbands who would never rise again. Some dared to hope they might be spared. Others prayed for death before the Ottomans turned their gaze upon them. The soldiers advanced not with mercy, but with cold precision. To them, the women were not grieving widows. They were spoils, living trophies of conquest. Shackles clinked like sinister bells as the soldiers carried chains, prepared for the prisoners who were to be dragged away. The wives of the fallen had no choice. Bound, stripped of dignity, they were marched like cattle through the ruins of their own lives. Imagine the terror in their eyes. They had watched their husbands die in defense of honor, homeland, and faith. Now they faced a different enemy, humiliation. What did it mean to be a wife in such a moment? Your identity was bound to the man who had fallen. With him gone, your protection vanished, and you became prey in a world where pity was weakness. The Ottomans knew this power well. They understood that true conquest was not only measured by the land taken or the men slain, but by breaking the women left behind. Each step those wives took in chains echoed the final defeat of their people. Because if the men were the swords of a nation, the women were its future. To seize them was to claim not just the battlefield, but the generations yet unborn. Children clung to their mothers, crying, until they were torn away. Some were killed outright, a quick, merciless end. Others were taken, raised not as children of their fathers, but as tools of the empire. For the wives, every scream carved into their hearts a fresh wound. Every separation a reminder that survival itself could be the cruelest punishment. And in the quiet moments of captivity, one thought consumed them. Death would have been easier. Death would have been kinder. Death would have allowed them to keep their honor intact. Instead, they lived with the torment of anticipation, never knowing whether they would be sold, defiled, or forced into a gilded prison where even their bodies were no longer their own. Was it worse to watch your husband bleed out on the battlefield, or to feel your own life unravel at the hands of the victors? To see the man you loved die with a sword in hand, and then to realize you would be dragged away, not as a widow but as property? For many, the answer was bitterly clear. The grave offered rest. The chains offered endless humiliation. The battlefields of Europe and the Near East were littered not just with corpses, but with broken families. And while the men who died were remembered as warriors, the women who survived were remembered by no one. Their suffering was hidden, silenced, and forgotten. Yet it was their fear, the fear of what awaited them after defeat, that lingered longer than the memory of swords and shields. The first night in captivity was always the longest. Some prayed, some wept, some closed their eyes and wished for death to come quietly in the dark. But dawn always came, and with it, the march toward markets, harems, and destinies that promised no escape. For these women, the war did not end when the last soldier fell. It began with the clinking of chains. Night fell quickly after the slaughter. The battlefield, once alive with the thunder of hooves and the clash of steel, was now a graveyard where only the wind whispered among the dead. The wives and daughters of the fallen were herded together like frightened animals, their cries swallowed by the endless dark. Some still carried scraps of hope, whispering prayers that perhaps they would be ransomed or spared out of pity. But pity was a luxury the conquerors could not afford. To show mercy was to invite weakness, and the Ottomans wanted something far greater than submission. They wanted to instill terror so deep it would echo for generations. The first cruelty came with the separation. Families were ripped apart, the bonds of blood shattered in an instant. Mothers were dragged one way, children another. A girl of 12 might be pulled from her mother's arms, screaming, her voice breaking until it became nothing more than hoarse sobs. The soldiers did not look back. To them, it was routine. To the women, it was the sound of a soul being torn apart. Some women resisted, clawing, screaming, striking at their captors with the desperation of cornered prey. But the response was swift and merciless. A single blade unsheathed, a sudden slash, and the defiance ended in silence. The others watched, their stomachs twisting, their throats too tight to scream. They understood the lesson. Resistance was not courage here. Resistance was a death sentence, and even death might not come quickly. Those who lived through that first night spoke of the silence that followed. Not the silence of peace, but of broken spirits. In the moonlight, shackles glimmered like the teeth of predators. The women huddled together, not for warmth, but for the illusion of safety. Each one knew that the worst was yet to come. The Ottomans marched them away from the battlefield at dawn, down roads littered with ashes and corpses. Every step was a funeral for the life they once knew. Behind them, their homes smoldered in ruin. Ahead, an unknown fate awaited, and in that uncertainty lay the most unbearable fear. They did not fear death. Death had walked beside them for days, its shadow stretching across every field. No, what they feared was the stripping away of their humanity. To be branded as spoils, to be handled like livestock, to be judged not by their voices or their dignity, but by the strength of their bodies and the smoothness of their skin. Some were marched toward the slave markets, where their value would be debated by strangers. Others would be taken to palaces, not as honored wives, but as silent captives in harems where obedience was law and defiance meant punishment beyond imagining. For the wives of fallen warriors, every possibility was a horror in itself. What was the weight of that fear? Imagine walking with chains around your wrists, feeling the bite of iron against your skin, knowing you were being led not toward freedom, but toward a future where you would never again choose your own path. Imagine carrying the memory of your husband's last breath while being forced into the arms of the enemy who killed him. Imagine living day after day with the knowledge that you had become a weapon in your captor's hand, a tool to erase your people by breaking you from within. For the Ottomans, this was more than cruelty. It was a strategy. By seizing the wives of the defeated, they struck not only at the fallen warriors but at the soul of entire nations. To enslave a woman was to enslave the bloodline, to rewrite the future, to ensure that the children of tomorrow would carry not the names of their fathers, but the legacy of their conquerors. And so the women marched, step after step, tear after tear. Their fear grew heavier than their chains. Death was no longer the enemy. Death was a release they could not reach. What awaited them was something far darker, a living captivity that would haunt them until their last breath. This was why defeated warriors' wives feared the Ottomans more than death itself. Because in death there is silence. But in life under their captors, there was no silence, only unending echoes of pain. The march ended not with freedom, but with a spectacle. Dust rose as the captives were herded into towns where their arrival was awaited like the coming of a grim festival. Men gathered in the marketplaces, not with pity, but with curiosity, their eyes scanning the women as though they were livestock brought for trade. The clang of chains was joined by the clamor of merchants shouting prices for spices, fabrics, and weapons, and then came the darker bidding for flesh. Slave markets were the empire's theater of cruelty. Here, women were no longer wives, mothers, or daughters. They were property, their worth measured by youth, beauty, and fertility. Auctioneers called out details with the casual detachment of men selling cattle. Strong hips for childbearing, clear skin, no disease, good teeth. Every word stripped away another layer of their humanity. Imagine the humiliation, standing under the gaze of strangers, forced to lift your arms, turn your face, display your body while men muttered and argued over your value. For the women who had once been honored wives of warriors, it was not merely degradation, it was the complete erasure of identity. A wife became a commodity, a mother became a price. The cries of children often mingled with the noise of the market. Some were sold alongside their mothers, their small hands clutching desperately at skirts and sleeves, refusing to let go until a whip or a soldier's fist forced separation. Others were sold alone, destined to grow up in foreign households, never to know the names of their fathers. And for the women, watching their children vanish into the crowd was a torment that no chain could contain. Not all buyers were cruel. Some sought servants, cooks, or companions. Yet even in those cases, the women's lives were no longer their own. Kindness did not erase ownership. A kind master was still a master, and the looming threat of being sold again, at any moment, remained. For many, this uncertainty was worse than outright brutality. A beating ends, but the fear of tomorrow never ends. Others, less fortunate, were destined for the harems. These women were purchased not for service, but for pleasure. The harem was not the gilded paradise of romantic legend. It was a prison cloaked in silk, a place where women lived in constant competition for survival, where beauty became both weapon and curse. The market decided who would be sent there, and once chosen, escape was impossible. Some women tried to devalue themselves in the market, hoping to avoid the eye of the wealthy. They wept openly, smeared dirt on their faces, and tore at their hair. But even this act of desperation often failed. To the buyers, sorrow was irrelevant. A woman's tears did not lessen her price. Sometimes, they only increased it, marking her as spirited, a challenge to be broken. And always, in the background, the soldiers watched. For them, this was victory in its purest form. The markets were proof that the empire's power stretched beyond the battlefield. Here, the defeat of warriors was transformed into the submission of their wives, their very futures sold beneath the banners of their conquerors. The air of the market reeked of sweat, dust, and despair. Women stood beneath the burning sun, their bodies aching from days of marching, their souls numb from the knowledge that they were no longer human in the eyes of those around them. Each transaction was a death, not of the body, but of identity, memory, and pride. And as coin exchanged hands, the women understood a chilling truth. They were not just captives. They were currency. They were messages to the world that resistance was futile, that even the strongest warriors could not protect what they loved most. For those who entered the markets, the hope of death often seemed merciful compared to the reality of being sold. And in their silence, in their lowered eyes and trembling hands, one question echoed endlessly. How does one survive when survival itself is the punishment? This was the market of misery, a place where humanity was weighed, priced, and auctioned away. The marketplace was not the end. For many women, it was only the gateway to another prison, one wrapped in silk and shadows. Those chosen for the harems of Ottoman rulers or elite officials found themselves stepping into a world that, at first glance, shimmered with beauty. Marble floors gleamed beneath flickering lamps. The air was heavy with incense and rosewater. Curtains of velvet and gold draped the rooms. It was a cage so polished, so perfumed, that one could almost mistake it for paradise. But beneath the silks lay chains. The harem was not freedom. It was a gilded prison. Inside, women were stripped of their pasts. No longer were they wives of warriors or daughters of free men. They were renamed, redressed, and remade to fit the desires of their captors. Their languages were silenced, their faiths suppressed, their memories of home forbidden. Every detail of their existence, when they ate, how they dressed, even whom they spoke to, was dictated by unseen masters. The harem was a place of constant tension. Rivalries simmered like poison beneath the surface. Each woman knew her survival depended on favor, the favor of eunuchs who enforced the rules, the favor of senior concubines who commanded respect, and, above all, the favor of the master himself. A smile at the wrong time, a whispered word overheard, a glance misinterpreted could mean the difference between rising in status or vanishing into oblivion. At night, fear lingered heavier than incense. The shuffle of footsteps down a corridor, the sudden pull of a curtain, the call of a eunuch's voice, all could signal that a woman was chosen. Chosen not for freedom, not for dignity, but for service in a master's bed. Some were summoned only once, used and discarded. Others were favored, drawn deeper into a web of power where every embrace was both survival and surrender. To the outside world, the harem was a place of luxury, of beauty, of women pampered beyond imagination. But those who lived within knew better. Behind the glittering walls, the women endured a life where choice was an illusion and every smile was a mask to hide despair. There were moments of rebellion, whispered songs in forbidden tongues, fleeting memories shared between captives about their lost families. But rebellion in the harem was always short-lived. A single act of defiance could bring severe punishment. Isolation, starvation, or worse. Some women disappeared altogether, their names never spoken again, their absence explained away as if they had never existed. And yet, survival demanded adaptation. Some women learned to wield the only power left to them, influence within the cage. They schemed, they bargained, they aligned themselves with allies, carving fragile paths to protect themselves and, if possible, their children. For in the harem, children were both blessings and curses. A child could elevate a woman's position, granting her a measure of security. But it could also bind her more tightly to her captor, her very motherhood controlled by the empire. The sound of laughter sometimes echoed in those halls, but it was laughter sharpened by desperation, brittle as glass. Beneath every smile was fear. Beneath every gesture was the knowledge that their lives belonged to someone else. The wives of defeated warriors, who had once lived with honor beside their men, now lived like shadows in a palace of light. The irony was cruel. They were surrounded by beauty, yet they themselves were broken. They were kept alive not as women, but as possessions, silken trophies locked away behind golden doors. What was worse, to die on the battlefield alongside one's husband, or to live in such splendor while stripped of freedom, of memory, of self? For many, the answer was clear. Death was honest. The harem was deception, a velvet shroud over a life that was no longer their own. Here, in the gilded cage, they learned the final truth. Survival was not salvation. Survival was servitude. And every breath they took was a reminder that their greatest fear had already come true. They had been conquered not just in body, but in soul. Conquest did not end when the swords fell silent. For the wives of defeated warriors, the battle followed them into their very bodies. Their wombs became the empire's weapon. A child born from their suffering was never their own. From the first cry, the infant belonged not to its mother, but to the empire. The Ottomans had perfected a system where motherhood itself was stripped of meaning. A woman could hold her child in her arms, feel the warmth of its skin, hear its breath against her chest, and yet know that at any moment, the empire could take it away. For some, that moment came quickly. Infants were sold like lambs in markets, their tiny hands displayed as if they were merchandise. Others were claimed by masters, destined to grow into servants or soldiers. A boy, if strong, might be trained for the Janissaries, raised not as his father's son, but as the sultan's weapon. A girl, if fair, might be set on the same path as her mother, prepared for sale, for service, for the gilded prison of the harem. The mothers were left in torment, forced to nurse and raise children who were never theirs, knowing that every lullaby, every whispered word, every embrace only strengthened the chains of the empire. Love itself became a tool of subjugation, and when the children were taken, as they always were, the grief was unbearable, yet it could not be shown. A tear could invite punishment. A scream could invite the whip. So mothers learned to grieve in silence, their sorrow buried in the stillness of the night. The empire's cruelty went deeper still. Lineages were deliberately severed. The wives of commanders and nobles were not permitted to pass down names, traditions, or faith. Bloodlines that once stood as symbols of defiance were erased, their heirs absorbed into the Ottoman machine. A boy raised as a Janissary was forbidden from knowing his true father. A girl who bore children in the harem could never teach them of the land she once called home. The empire understood that true conquest was not written in ink or carved in stone. It was written in blood, reshaped across generations. And so the womb became both battlefield and prison. It was not enough to enslave the body. The Ottomans enslaved the future. They turned mothers into unwilling vessels of their own domination, forcing them to bear children whose lives would strengthen the empire that destroyed their families. For many women, childbirth was not joy but terror. The cries of newborns were not the sounds of hope, but the echoes of captivity reborn. Some mothers prayed their children would not survive infancy, believing death was kinder than the life awaiting them. Others clung desperately, even knowing the child would be taken, hoping that a stolen embrace was better than none at all. The cruelty was not hidden. Communities saw their daughters taken, saw their sons turned into soldiers who returned years later, unrecognizable, loyal not to family but to empire. Villages that had once stood proud were hollowed from within. The population itself shifted. Mothers without children, fathers without heirs, generations erased as if they had never lived. For the wives of defeated warriors, this was a punishment worse than death. Death ended pain. This was endless. It stretched beyond a lifetime, reaching into the unborn, reshaping entire peoples until their roots were severed and their branches bent to Ottoman rule. And yet, the empire called it law, called it an order, called it civilization. Scribes recorded the births, tallied the children, and documented every womb as if women were not human beings but numbers on a ledger. In those records, love was erased. Family was erased. Only power remained. This was the legacy carved into the lives of the conquered. A woman could endure chains, whips, and humiliation. But to lose her children, to lose the very future she carried, was a torment that never healed. And it was this, more than anything, that made them fear the Ottomans beyond death itself. Death leaves a grave, chains leave scars, but erasure leaves nothing. And for the wives of defeated warriors, the Ottomans delivered not only cruelty in life, but silence in memory. The empire understood that conquest was never complete until the past itself was rewritten. And so, the women who once carried names, faiths, and families were stripped of them. In Ottoman records, they did not appear as daughters, wives, or mothers. They appeared as entries, nameless, origin reduced to a word, value reduced to a price. A Christian wife of a commander might be renamed in an instant, her old identity dissolved with ink on paper. A woman from Hungary might awaken one morning as Fatima, her past forever severed, her new name forced into her mouth until it no longer felt foreign. This was more than domination. It was annihilation. To erase a woman's name was to erase her from history, to deny her even the dignity of remembrance. Families left behind would never know what became of their daughters. Communities whispered of their loss, but in time even whispers faded. The women became ghosts in their own lifetimes, and then, after death, they became nothing at all. And yet, their absence was louder than any memory. Villages with no daughters, houses with no wives, bloodlines cut short, entire communities reshaped by their disappearance. The empire had not only taken women, it had stolen the balance of entire peoples. For generations, the scars remained visible. Villages hollowed of women, families fractured beyond repair, children raised in foreign tongues, faiths torn apart. But perhaps the cruelest fate was for those who survived, returned, and yet found no home waiting. Some escaped, some were freed, some clawed their way back to the lands of their birth, but the world they returned to no longer recognized them. A wife once honored was now treated as tainted. Families shunned daughters who had lived in harems or served Ottoman masters, no matter how unwilling. Churches and communities refused them, casting them as outcasts, forever marked by their ordeal. Their survival, instead of being honored, was seen as shame. They lived as shadows, unwanted by both empire and homeland. The Ottomans ensured their suffering was not only physical, not only generational, but eternal. By making their pain invisible, they made it last forever. The silence was its own form of violence. And so, when we ask why defeated warriors' wives feared the Ottomans more than death itself, the answer lies not only in whips, chains, or cages. It lies in erasure. Death offers closure. But to be taken, renamed, sold, humiliated, forced to bear children who were never truly yours, and then to vanish from history as though you never existed, that is a fate without end. Historians once celebrated the Ottomans for their architecture, their administration, and their military brilliance. They spoke of tolerance, of culture, of civilization. But hidden in archives lie the ledgers of misery. Documents filled with nameless women, their prices carefully written, their identities carefully destroyed. Those pages tell a different story, one written not in glory but in grief. And that grief still lingers. For centuries, entire regions carried the trauma. Songs, prayers, and folktales whisper of daughters lost, of mothers stolen, of wives never returned. Even now, the silence speaks. The absence echoes. The Ottomans had proved that conquest was not finished when cities fell, when armies broke, when kings bent the knee. Conquest lived on in the women they took, in the children born in chains, in the names erased from memory. This was why the wives of defeated warriors feared the Ottomans more than death itself. Because death would have given them peace. But the Ottomans gave them something far worse. They turned them into shadows. Forgotten voices, erased lives, lost forever in the machinery of empire. If this story shocked you, remember, it's only one of countless forgotten horrors buried beneath history's polished surface. Don't let these voices remain in silence. Subscribe now, hit the like button, so that the YouTube algorithm will recommend this video to more viewers like you to learn about the dark, hidden histories, and join us as we uncover more hidden, dark stories the textbooks never dared to tell. Because the past isn't dead, it still haunts us.